Hello, all my beloved friends out there in Facebook land. Sorry we're getting going a little later today, but I've had some things to do today, which is really good. Most of you know I'm a pastor at High Point Church, and our food closet has really been bumping given the coronavirus quarantine, so we've been able to get food for a lot of people. But, I will say that Alva has been a little impatient to spend some time with you guys, so I definitely, want to keep going with our reading. Again, we will be reading one chapter today. There will be a lot of one chapter days because, some of the chapters are long, and I don't want to be, doing 45 minutes or so every day. And so, today's chapter is called Across the Valley. The long journey through the Lacinian Valley ran smoothly. They kept near the river, but made wide curves to avoid the settlements along the waterfront. Hellel wanted to avoid all possible human contact in order to avoid any questions about their journey. Periodically, however, one of the men would be allowed to go into a town for supplies. Good meat if Chad and Shinar had seen nothing tasty to shoot recently. Fresh bread, sometimes a small barrel of ale. Hellel would only send men who he was sure could avoid attention. This was limited to Jagrock, Tombus, Pensor, or Alva. The others did not complain much because it was somewhat flattering to think they could not enter a town without attracting attention. Besides, this saved them more walking after a long day's journey. At the end of each day's ride, each member of the company, with the exception of Philor, would curry and brush his or her horse. Philor would immediately begin cooking dinner. The others were supposed to take turns caring for his horse, but on most days Hope volunteered. Nera insisted on setting up their tent, and Hope wanted to contribute more to the journey. Besides, caring for horses was something she loved doing. She would talk and sing to the horses as she brushed them, and they always listened with a look of love in their eyes. Most of the terrain through the valley was lush and beautiful. The river kept the area well watered, and most of Lacinia was beautiful anyway. There were long grasslands, areas more densely populated with trees, but not enough to constitute a forest such as there was far south in the valley. Most of the trees were thick and strong, with large green leaves and many branches reaching out in every direction. Many of the trees were even bigger than those they had first seen by the river. Hope desperately wanted to climb them. Hellel had seen to it that she had a tree house in one of the trees in her childhood home, and it was one of her favorite places. She now began to think about what amazing tree houses could be made in one of these trees. She also thought that it would be fun to live in a tree house. There was no time for tree climbing on the trail, but on 2 occasions they stopped for the night early enough that she was able to climb a tree after she brushed her horse. Nera frowned on this, but Hellel said to let her have a little fun. Most Lacinian nobles would have thought it beneath a grown woman's dignity to climb trees, but Hope had no concern for what she considered to be silly mores. The trees seemed to perk up as she climbed them. She would sing to them, and they seemed to stop and listen. On one of these occasions, Chad and Shinar joined her in climbing a tree. The 3 of them had a good game of tree tag. Nera worried that someone might get hurt, but the brothers were young men of amazing dexterity, and tree climbing came natural to Hope. Bonson was jealous of the brothers for having fun with Hope, but as a Huron lord, he could not bring himself to join in. Some days they would ride through immense fields of wild flowers. Some of the fields were all one color. There were fields of small white flowers, there were fields of larger pink flowers as well. There were fields of tall purple flowers and fields of fluffy yellow ones. There were also some fields where many different kinds of flowers were mixed together. Hope delighted in the flowers. She knew the name of each kind of flower because she had read many books about flowers, and she remembered anything and everything she had ever read. The flowers always seemed to brighten as Hope rode by, and though it may have seemed like a trick of the eye, they seemed to reach up to her as though they wanted her to caress them. She would have loved to stop and caress each one individually. She would have loved to sing each flower its own lullaby. She wished she could give each one its own individual name. But of course, she knew there was no time for this. They had to keep riding. Day after day they rode, talking and singing. At night they would make camp. They would enjoy a good meal, which Philor never failed on, and talk around the campfire. Sometimes they would talk in smaller groups, sometimes all together. Alva would make a flirty comment to Nero when an opportunity presented itself, but she always seemed unaffected, so these comments gradually became fewer. He could see he was not getting anywhere, and he was getting dangerously close to being annoying. If he had any chance at all, this certainly was not the way to her heart. At times he would engage her in serious conversation. She would be civil, but give short answers to his questions. It was always clear that she was not particularly interested in having the conversation go on. Perhaps he should have started with a serious conversation and let the flirtation come later. But what could he do? He hadn't had time to think about romantic strategies on the day when they met in Sal's tavern. Perhaps he'd never been good at flirting anyway. Perhaps the girls in the village he grew up in only cared about him because of who his father was. Who knew? Who cared? He had long thought romance was not for him anyway. Obviously, this tall and unusual woman would do nothing to change this. It was probably better that way. Such were Alva Dene's thoughts as they journeyed on. On a certain night, when they were more than halfway across the valley, Hope worked up her courage, braving Nera to ask Prior a question. "Prior, could you tell me more about the ugly girl in the hills with the thrilling smile?" Prior smiled big. "Sweetheart," he said, "I've got a confession to make." At the word sweetheart, Bonson's head jerked up unintentionally to see what was going on. "The truth is," Prior continued, "none of those girls ever really existed. I just wrote it as a funny song. I shouldn't have let you go on believing they were real, but you were so sweet talking about them, I couldn't bear to break it to you. I'm real sorry if that's disappointing." "You made them up?" Hope asked. "Why?" "Well, I wasn't lying exactly, but songs are like stories. They aren't all about real people and things, they just make for good entertainment." Of course Hope knew this. She had read lots of stories that she knew weren't true. She could give a five-minute description of what fiction meant if someone asked. She had just thought Prior's song was true. He sang it so heartily, and it seemed so sweet. "But why ugly girls?" Hope asked. "Just seem funnier that way, I guess." "Isn't that a little mean?" Hope said with gentle reproach. "I suppose, except they weren't real, so I didn't think about hurting them." "It might hurt a humpback girl, or one who drools," Hope suggested. Keeping from smiling at this comment was the most difficult thing Prior, Pinsor, or Alva had ever done, but somehow they pulled it off. Keel had to turn around and fake a coughing fit. "I'm sorry, sweetie," Prior said. Again, Bonson looked uneasy. "If you want, I'll never sing it again, I promise." "Well," Hope said, "it seems like such a nice song, and you do say nice things about them, so I guess it's okay." She couldn't bear the thought of a song that she had grown to love so much becoming extinct. "Have you ever had any real sweethearts?" she asked. "Some," Prior responded. He had actually had many, but he didn't want to confess this to Hope. "But, none of them were exactly what you'd call ugly. If I'd known I'd meet you, though, I would have never romanced anything but an ugly girl in my life. I swear it." Hope smiled beamingly. "What a sweet thing to say," she said. "And will you ever marry?" When she asked this question, Bon Son began to fidget uneasily. Someday I'll marry me a full-sized woman," Prior said. They all laughed. "Too bad Pincer's daughters are all married," Alva said. "Yep," said Pincer, "especially since I always wanted mountains for grandchildren. But mine were too short for Pincer anyway." "Like the one that lived down by the lake," Alva said. Pincer smiled. "And they was all too good for you, Alva," he said. "That they were," said Alva. This time he was not joking. "Well," said Hope, "I'm sure you'll meet a wonderful girl to marry someday." "I'm sure I will too, darlin'," Pincer said. At the word "darlin'," which Prior had said. At the word "darling," which Prior had meant in no way beyond brotherly affection, Bon Son inadvertently dropped his mug of hot ale. "Easy, champ," Prior said to Bon Son. "A big old bear may love the stars in a reverential sort of way, but that don't mean he thinks he can take one home to Mama." Bon Son reddened and stared at Prior. Red-hot steel was in his eyes. He would have responded in rage, but Hope did not seem to follow what Prior was saying. Bon Son did not want to reveal his jealous love, so he remained in seething silence. He hoped she did not understand what had just transpired. Hope understood full well what Prior meant, but she thought it better to pretend she didn't. She did not want to embarrass Bon Son any further. To diffuse the tension, she shifted the conversation. "Mr. Alva," she said, addressing him, "why aren't you married?" "Well," Alva said, "I guess I just never met the right woman, although my story might not be over yet." With this last comment, he smiled and gave a look at Nira. She gave him back her usual cold stare. "Well, maybe it isn't that," he said genially. "Have you ever been in love?" Hope asked. "Once," he responded. When he said this, it struck him that it was completely true. He had been in love only once. This meant that however much he might admire Nira, he was not in love with her. "Would you tell me about it?" Hope asked. "You never tell stories about yourself. You just laugh at everyone else's stories and sit there like a log." Hope meant no insult. She just meant he was not a wealth of information about himself, like Keel or Prior. But Alva took no offense. He thought the metaphor captured his essence rather well. He did not like telling stories about himself, but like all the men, he delighted in pleasing Hope. He would never tell her no unless it was absolutely necessary. These 9 warriors would have put on an opera if Hope had asked them to. "Is that all right, Lady Nira?" he asked respectfully. Nira nodded graciously. She was very relieved that Alva had not said that she was his one love. She was also curious to hear any information she could gain about Alva's past. She had long wondered exactly who he was and how he knew how to fight so well. "Well," Alva began, "my story needs a little background. I was born just after the Huron-Lacinian War, which my father fought in. He didn't fight for the Hurons." Alva looked at Hellel when he made this comment. Hellel had taken a sudden interest in the conversation, and Alva wanted to make sure he was comfortable with him continuing. "That was a long time ago, and both sides fought bravely," said Hellel. "After the Great Betrayal," Alva continued. "The Great Peace," Bon Son snapped. "As you will," said Alva. "After the great event that ended the war for better or worse, my father gathered his most treasured valuables in some carts and moved us to a goat farming village in the northern hills at the foot of the Carginian Range." The Carginian Range was the barrier on the northern side of the Lacinian Valley. My mother died in childbirth. She had me when she was fairly old. I had two older brothers who died in the battle for the Camden Pass. The grief hit her hard, I think, but she mustered enough strength to give birth. Then I suppose she had nothing left. Both Hope and Nera seem very sympathetic here. Hope seemed to grieve more for Alva's mother than he ever had himself. He did not remember any of this firsthand. My father bought a plot of land from one of the wealthier farmers in the village and built us a small house. He didn't take up goat farming, though. He had a little money so he could put his attention on me until I was weaned. Then he saw to my education himself. He taught me every subject, including how to fight. He put a sword in my hand as soon as I could hold one. We did sword practice every day that I am old enough to remember. When I was 13, he said it was time we started earning a living. We started doing the kind of work I do now, mostly delivering messages and protection. The work could be a little rough because Lassania was a little more chaotic right after the war than it is now. We had what was my first fight when I was 14, and Father said I did fine. Well, in addition to raising me for my first 13 season changes, my father taught the villagers some things he knew to make the village a better place. He taught one man the blacksmith trade. "Your father knew the blacksmith trade?" Thomas asked. By this point, everyone was listening intently to Alva's story. He was somewhat of a mystery to all of them except Pensor. Yes, he made a point of knowing every trade he thought he might need someday. Pensor smiled knowingly when Alva said this. Anyway, Alva continued, he had quite a collection of weapons he had kept after the war, and he taught the smith to make more. He felt like our village should be a safe village, so he taught the men to fight in the evenings. They all really enjoyed it, and I loved helping him teach the things he had taught me. The northern hills do not have many bandit gangs now, but there were some of them then. Raids didn't happen often, but there were some in living memory. In those raids, the bandits had stolen goats, valuables, and even kidnapped some girls. Hope felt a sudden chill at this last bit of information. She had heard of girls being kidnapped in some of her reading, and it was the most terrifying thing she could imagine. After I was 13, we spent half of a given season change out on jobs, but we usually spent the other half in the village. My father was continuing my education all the time. While we were in the village, I became quite the charmer of young ladies. Or, so I thought. They all laughed at my jokes, and I spent all the time I could talking to them and flirting with them. Nera smiled to herself. "I'll bet he did," she thought. At the time, I thought I was a regular Jackrill. Alva continued. Everyone knew this expression, though most had not read the Love Chronicles. Now I realized they took to me mainly because of my father and that he was such an important man in the village. But when I was 18, I fell hard for one particular girl in the village. Her name was Bally. She had curly brown hair and shining green eyes. She loved a good joke, and we spent hours teasing each other and laughing together. By the time I was 19, we became engaged. We planned to marry a year later. Her father wanted to make sure I was serious because my father and I were gone so often. "And what did your father think?" Philor asked. He said that a good wife was hard to find, and if I'd found one, I should hang on tight, especially if she'd put up with my long absences. He was quite taken with Bally and was happy for me. As it would happen, during our 20th season change in the village, a few months before my coming marriage, a gang of mountain bandits made a raid on the village. Luckily, Father and I were there. The bandits were not ready for this village. The goat farmers grabbed their swords and bows and fought them off. Father and I led the defense and slew quite a few men that day. I fought pretty well myself. I killed some men, though I took a few wounds. That night, when Bally was patching me up, especially dressing a big gash on my right thigh, I kept talking about the battle. We only lost 4 men. Losing those men was rough, but no village anyone had ever ever even heard of had stopped a bandit attack like that. None of the women and children were hurt, and I felt on the top of the world. I had fought well, and still had the excitement of the battle on me. But after a while, I realized that Bally was scared. She'd been scared for my safety during the battle, so she had watched me through the whole thing. Now, she was scared of me. It scared her the way I killed those men, but what really scared her was how little it affected me. I wasn't bothered that I killed them, and she didn't understand that. Father had taught me well. He always said, "Always stand up for the weak and helpless, but never be weak and helpless yourself." Bad men do bad things, and good men have to stop them. Father taught me that from the very beginning, but for a sweet girl like Bally, I had learned it a little too well. "Didn't she know you were protecting her and the others?" Hope asked. "Well, she did, and she really appreciated it, but she told me she just couldn't marry me because she would always be afraid of me." I realized she was right. Bad men do bad things, and the men who can have to stop them. But the men who do that best are making the world safe so that other men can marry the sweet young girls. Good and simple men like farmers. Romance and marriage weren't for a man like me. "You wouldn't marry anyone else?" Hope asked. I figured the girls I would want would feel the same way she did, and I understood why. She married the village healer, the one who takes care of sick goats and sick people. Better a sweet girl like Bally should marry a healer than a killer like me. I see them sometimes when I go back to the village to check on my belongings. I pay a nice old woman to live in our house and keep it up. Bally and her husband have many children, and they are very happy. It makes me happy to see her happy." "You weren't angry with her?" Hope asked. "No, I really did understand. A sweet, wonderful girl like Bally shouldn't have to sleep next to a man with blood on his hands." "Couldn't you just have washed up before bed?" Hope asked. Alva laughed heartily, as did the others. Even Nira chuckled. "Now, why didn't I think of that 20 season changes ago?" said Alva. "Bless my worn, cracked old soul. You are the sweetest thing that ever came into this world, aren't you?" Hope glowed warmly at this compliment. Nira swelled with pride. Alva's description of Hope was certainly true. Alva noticed this and thought there might be a glimmer of hope with Nira after all. Bonson was uncomfortable again because of another man complimenting his love, even if it was an ugly little man like Alva. "How many men did you kill that day?" Bonson asked Alva in a slightly mocking tone. "I'm not sure," Alva replied. He did know, but he didn't want to say. "His father said it was 10 men, said Pensor. "Fathers are given to exaggeration," Bonson replied. "Not Alva's father, and I've seen Alva in action. He could cut through 10 men like cake." Bonson scoffed. "Well, I believe it," said Pryor. "Yeah, but the fact that he dropped you in a fight doesn't mean he could kill 10 men, Bonson replied. "Do you think you could do that, my lord?" Pryor asked. "I have a habit of sending big old bears crying home to Mama," Bonson replied coolly. "Enough," said Hillel loudly. "We'll have no more fighting. You all know the rules. Let's all get some sleep now." Bonson was relieved. He could not have backed down, but he was not sure he could handle Pryor in a hand-to-hand fight. With swords, certainly, but if he were to fight Pryor at all, it would be better to wait for a chance to fight in a way that he had the advantage. Alva had defeated Pryor, but he had surprised him. Pryor would be on guard in the future, especially against a man with Bonson's height and muscular frame. Hillel had many questions for Alva, but he let them go. Alva had talked more about himself than ever before, and he was content to wait for more information when the time was right. And the Lord add his blessing to the reading of Hope. Be with us tomorrow as we read chapter 9 and following. The Storm Begins.